Two identical twins, same genes, same upbringing, both gain 30 pounds. One develops diabetes within 2 years. The other remains metabolically healthy for decades. The difference isn't willpower. It isn't diet quality. It's where their bodies decided to store that extra fat. And more importantly, it's a biological signal their fat tissue is sending that you've probably never heard of. Most people think visceral fat is just belly fat that's harder to lose. That's wrong on multiple levels. Visceral fat isn't stubborn because of its location. It's different because it operates under an entirely separate metabolic command system. And until you understand what controls that system, no amount of calorie restriction or cardio will unlock it. Here's what makes visceral fat uniquely dangerous and uniquely resistant. Subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch, drains into your systemic circulation through the vena cava. When it releases fatty acids or hormones, they get diluted throughout your entire bloodstream before reaching any single organ. Visceral fat does something completely different. It drains directly into the portal vein, which feeds straight into your liver before distributing anywhere else. Research published in Diabetes demonstrated this through an elegant transplantation study. Scientists took fat tissue and transplanted it into mice, either into locations that drained systemically or into the mesentery where it drained portally. Only the portal-drained fat caused glucose intolerance and liver insulin resistance, despite identical fat mass. This is called the portal theory. When visceral fat releases free fatty acids and inflammatory cytokines, your liver receives concentrated doses before dilution. Studies in American Journal of Physiology found that visceral fat has significantly higher expression of hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme that breaks down stored fat into free fatty acids. But here's the paradox. This doesn't mean visceral fat shrinks easily. It means visceral fat actively floods your liver with metabolic signals that create insulin resistance, which then signals back to visceral fat to stay locked down. There's a hormone most people have never heard of that functions as a master regulator between visceral fats and metabolic health: adiponectin. Unlike most hormones that increase with fat accumulation, adiponectin does the opposite. Research in the Journal of Korean Medical Science examined over 1,300 people and found that those with the lowest adiponectin levels and highest visceral fat had a 13-fold increased risk of insulin resistance compared to those with high adiponectin and low visceral fat. Adiponectin is anti-inflammatory, improves insulin sensitivity, and directly signals the liver to stop producing excess glucose. But here's the critical part. Visceral fat actively suppresses adiponectin production. Studies show visceral adipose tissue releases inflammatory cytokines, particularly TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, that directly inhibit adiponectin synthesis. The more visceral fat you have, the less adiponectin you produce. The less adiponectin you produce, the more insulin resistant you become. The more insulin resistant you become, the more your body defends visceral fat. This creates a biological lock. Your visceral fat is literally suppressing the hormone that would allow it to shrink. Research published in Proceedings of the Japanese Academy found that increasing adiponectin through lifestyle intervention directly improves visceral fat mobilization by activating AMP-activated protein kinase in muscle and fat tissue. The first biological change before visceral fat shrinks isn't cortisol dropping, it's adiponectin rising. When your liver receives constant fatty acid bombardment from visceral fat through the portal vein, it responds by becoming insulin resistant as a protective mechanism. Research in Obesity Journal showed that portal-drained free fatty acids increase liver expression of gluconeogenic enzymes, G6-PACE and PEPCK, by over 160%. Your liver starts making more glucose even when you don't need it. But insulin resistance isn't just a liver problem, it becomes a fat storage command. When your liver can't properly handle glucose, your pancreas releases more insulin to compensate. Hyperinsulinemia then signals fat cells, particularly visceral fat cells, which have high insulin receptor density, to stop releasing stored energy and start storing more. Studies in metabolic syndrome and related disorders found that visceral adipose tissue's ability to suppress hepatic glucose production is severely impaired in obesity. Even when insulin levels rise, the liver continues producing glucose because it's receiving contradictory signals from portal-drained fatty acids. This creates what researchers call selective hepatic insulin resistance. Your liver responds to insulin for fat storage, but ignores insulin for glucose control. You get the worst of both worlds, rising blood sugar and increased fat accumulation. Breaking this cycle requires the liver to restore normal insulin sensitivity. That restoration doesn't begin with forcing fat loss. It begins when the inflammatory signal from visceral fat through the portal vein decreases, which only happens when adiponectin levels rise and cortisol levels stabilize. The biological gate that opens before visceral fat shrinks involves 3 simultaneous shifts. Adiponectin must rise, inflammatory cytokines must fall, and the liver must regain insulin sensitivity. Research shows these don't happen through force. They happen through metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is your body's ability to switch between burning carbohydrates and fats based on availability. Studies using respiratory quotient measurements show that people with visceral obesity are metabolically inflexible, meaning they're locked into glucose-dependent energy production even when fatty acids are available. This inflexibility is both a cause and consequence of visceral fat accumulation. When you improve metabolic flexibility through consistent sleep, adequate protein intake, and resistance training, something remarkable happens. Research in diabetes care showed that 4 weeks of physical training increased adiponectin receptor expression in both visceral and subcutaneous fat, independent of weight loss. The receptors became more sensitive before fat mass changed. This receptor sensitivity is the gate. Once adiponectin receptors in fat tissue and liver upregulate, adiponectin's signals can finally be heard. The tissue becomes responsive to commands that were previously ignored. Heart rate variability research supports this. Studies in PLOS One found that higher HRV, indicating better metabolic flexibility and nervous system regulation, strongly correlates with lower visceral fat, independent of total body fat. The nervous system shift your reference document describes is real, but it's not just about stress. It's about restoring the metabolic machinery that allows adiponectin to function. Unlike your references' focus on feelings, there are measurable biological markers that indicate this shift. Research identifies several. Fasting insulin begins to drop before weight changes. Studies show that improved insulin sensitivity precedes visible fat loss by several weeks. If you're tracking blood work, seeing fasting insulin decrease from 12 to 8 micro-IU per milliliter signals the gate is opening even if the scale hasn't moved. Post-meal glucose stability improves. Continuous glucose monitor studies show that metabolic flexibility manifests as smaller glucose spikes and faster returns to baseline after eating. If your glucose used to peak at 160 milligrams per deciliter after meals and now peaks at 130 milligrams per deciliter, your liver is regaining insulin sensitivity. C-reactive protein decreases. This inflammatory marker reflects the systemic inflammation that visceral fat generates. Research shows CRP drops correspond with adiponectin increases even before substantial fat loss. Morning cortisol awakening response normalizes. Studies tracking cortisol patterns found that high morning cortisol spikes correlate with visceral fat accumulation. As the nervous system regulates, the cortisol awakening response becomes more moderate, typically dropping from 15 plus nanomoles per liter to under 10 nanomoles per liter increase within 30 minutes of waking. These aren't feelings. These are objective biological changes that precede visible visceral fat reduction. The research is clear. Hormonal regulation changes first, receptor sensitivity changes second, and only then does fat mobilization become possible. The research shows specific behaviors that block adiponectin function and maintain insulin resistance despite dietary compliance. Chronic caloric restriction without refeeds. Studies in the European Journal of Applied Physiology found that continuous severe restriction decreases adiponectin levels independent of weight loss. Paradoxically, moderate restriction with periodic refeeds maintains higher adiponectin than constant severe restriction. Training while under-recovered. Research shows excessive exercise volume with inadequate recovery increases IL-6 and TNF-alpha, both of which suppress adiponectin synthesis. The study tracked athletes performing high-volume training and found those who trained most had lowest adiponectin levels and highest visceral fat retention. Inconsistent meal timing. Animal studies demonstrate that feeding pattern regularity influences adiponectin more than food composition. Irregular eating disrupts circadian regulation of adipose tissue, suppressing adiponectin regardless of calories consumed. Under gram of protein per meal. Research shows amino acids, particularly leucine, stimulate adiponectin production through mTOR-independent pathways. Studies found that meals containing under 25 grams of protein failed to stimulate adiponectin synthesis in older adults, while meals exceeding 35 grams activated production. Prioritizing cardio over resistance training. Research in diabetes care demonstrated that resistance training specifically increases adiponectin receptor expression in muscle and fat, while excessive endurance training can suppress it through chronic inflammation. These aren't general health tips. These are research-backed factors that specifically interfere with the adiponectin-mediated gate that must open before visceral fat mobilization. Based on the research mechanisms, here's what directly supports adiponectin function and liver insulin sensitivity. Prioritize sleep consistency over duration. Research shows that regular sleep-wake timing matters more for metabolic flexibility than occasionally getting 9 hours. Target the same wake time daily, even weekends. Studies found this normalized cortisol patterns within 2 weeks and increased adiponectin within 4 weeks. Implement protein pacing. Research demonstrates that distributing 30 to 40 grams protein across 3 meals increases adiponectin more effectively than the same total protein consumed irregularly. The leucine threshold for activating adiponectin synthesis requires adequate per-meal amounts. Use resistance training as primary stimulus. Studies show 2 to 3 full-body resistance sessions weekly increased adiponectin receptor expression by 40% after 4 weeks. The insulin-sensitizing effects persist for 48 hours post-exercise. Include weekly refeeds on training days. Research found that single-day carbohydrate increases to maintenance levels every 5 to 7 days maintain adiponectin levels during fat loss phases, while continuous restriction suppressed it. Measure what matters. Track fasting insulin quarterly, not just weight. Studies show fasting insulin dropping from diabetic range, greater than 15, to optimal range, less than 8, correlates more strongly with visceral fat reduction than BMI changes. Manage inflammation through omega-3 intake. Research demonstrates 2 to 3 grams daily EPA-DHA directly increases adiponectin synthesis and improves liver insulin sensitivity independent of fat loss. This isn't about working harder. It's about creating biological conditions where adiponectin can function, allowing the metabolic gates to open. Here's what research shows about how long this actually takes. Studies tracking adiponectin changes with intervention found measurable increases within 2 to 4 weeks of consistent sleep and resistance training, even without weight loss. Liver insulin sensitivity, measured by glucose clamp studies, improved within 4 to 6 weeks when inflammatory cytokines decreased. But visible visceral fat reduction lagged by 6 to 8 additional weeks. Research using CT scanning to measure visceral adipose tissue found that hormonal improvements preceded measurable fat reduction by approximately 2 months. This explains why people abandon effective protocols. The biology changes first, but they're looking for physical changes. Studies in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology found that participants who continued protocols showing hormonal improvement without immediate fat loss eventually experienced visceral fat reduction of 15 to 25% over 16 weeks. Those who abandoned protocols due to lack of visible change at week 6 never achieved the hormonal threshold needed for sustained fat mobilization. The research demonstrates a clear sequence. Adiponectin rises first, inflammatory cytokines fall second, liver insulin sensitivity improves third, and visceral fat mobilizes fourth. Each phase requires 3 to 4 weeks. Trying to force faster results by increasing intensity or restriction disrupts the sequence by suppressing adiponectin and increasing inflammatory signaling. Trust the biology. The gate opens invisibly before fat loss becomes visible. If you're tracking the right markers, fasting insulin, HRV, morning cortisol, you'll see the changes happening weeks before your waistline confirms them. If your belly fat won't budge despite perfect adherence, you're not broken. You're waiting for a biological gate to open that force cannot unlock. That gate is controlled by adiponectin, regulated by inflammatory cytokines, and defended by liver insulin resistance. The research is clear. You cannot force visceral fat to shrink by creating larger deficits or training harder. Those strategies suppress adiponectin, increase inflammation, and strengthen the metabolic lock. Instead, create conditions where adiponectin rises naturally: consistent sleep timing, adequate per-meal protein, regular resistance training, periodic refeeds, reduced chronic inflammation. Track objective markers: fasting insulin, glucose stability, HRV, inflammatory markers. These change before visible fat loss and confirm the biology is shifting. When adiponectin rises, inflammatory cytokines fall and liver insulin sensitivity restores. Visceral fat mobilization becomes inevitable, not because you forced it, because the biological conditions that defended it no longer exist. If this changed how you understand fat loss, type yes below. Share with someone stuck in the force and fail cycle. Subscribe for research-backed content that explains how your biology actually works, not how fitness marketing says it should. The gate exists. You can't force it open, but you can create the conditions where it opens naturally.